Welcome back, everyone, to SYFY WIRE live here at C2E2. We're in day 2, is having a lot of fun. Like I said, we're here with SYFY WIRE. SYFY WIRE is a place where you can get all things geeky, nerdy, and comic booky, and cartoony, and everything else through articles, podcasts, videos, and more. So be sure to check that out. I'm Andre, here with Katie Wilson.
Hey.
And we have a very special guest here, Tim Lapatino. He's the author of Art of Atari and the editor of the Undisputed Street Fighter books. And we are actually here to talk about a video game icon, definitely one of the earliest video games I've ever played. We're talking, of course, about Pac-Man.
Or Andre's main in Smash.
Yes, yeah, or AKA my main in Smash. But yes, just the origins of Pac-Man, which actually has a lot of roots right here in Chicago. So I guess that's where we can start out, Tim. Like, can you just take us back to the origin of Pac-Man and specifically how he has this relationship with Chicago?
Yeah, totally. So a lot of people know Pac-Man is a Japanese game, right? And it was created and released in 1980 in Japan. And the thinking behind the game was that, there were a lot of shooting games and a lot of sort of war-focused games in the arcades, and they were really looking for something that would appeal to, everybody, not just, guys in these arcades, but really appeal to women as well. And so they thought of, well, what was, the universal thing that people could really get behind, and the idea of eating. Pac-Man basically eats, and everybody eats, so it kind of works out well. And they created Pac-Man. The guy who sort of like headed it up was Toru Iwatani. And the game was pretty popular in Japan. It did well. But when it came over here, they licensed it to a company called Midway here in Chicago. And they basically had free reign to make these cabinets and basically distribute them all over the US. And it went bonkers. It went totally crazy. It was super popular. They sold over 100,000 cabinets, which is, like second all time in terms of arcade games. But the bigger thing was that the Japanese company licensed Pac-Man to Midway here in Chicago, and they decided it was so popular that they put it on everything. They put it on sleeping bags and underwear and, action figures, and Pac-Man basically became not just a really popular game, but like a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, well, that's what I think is interesting about it, because we had so many games prior to that were very popular games, but you were a ship, or you were sort of a nameless, faceless character, whereas Pac-Man was an actual character you could identify with, and then you even have the Ghost Monsters, and they're having their names, so it felt like that was an easy way for it to transition into the parts of pop culture.
Right, and people forget that Pac-Man was one of the first, character-based games where there was somebody who had a little bit of personality, and you weren't just a ship or a base or a square. Pac-Man has sort of an anima. He has a reason for being, even if it's just to eat, right? The idea that you're somebody that people could get behind, and I think that's part of the popularity.
How do you think the environment of Chicago has helped shape Pac-Man over the past, since the beginning?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And one of the funny things is I don't think people realize that, but even before arcade games were big, Chicago was basically the home of pinball. So, so many pinball companies were here, and so there's this whole network of distributors and, cabinet makers and fabricators, so that when Pac-Man got huge and then other video game companies sort of took up the torch, this was sort of the Detroit of arcade manufacturing, because there's all these companies and then all these manufacturers and all this distribution, because Chicago's very centrally located. So, it was a huge part of the economy here in the late 70s and the early 80s. So, I think there's that sort of the financial side and the distributing side, but also just culturally. I think Chicago's a place where, we don't talk about ourselves a lot, what we do kind of speaks more, and I think most people don't realize that Pac-Man has these deep roots here in Chicago. If it wasn't for a Chicago-based company, Pac-Man wouldn't be as big as he is today.
Yeah, and I feel like unless you live here, a lot of people don't realize how many Pac-Man related things there are to do in Chicago. There's a restaurant, arcade, but what else is there for people to check out?
A lot of it is in the history. A lot of it is the history of these games in this city. But yeah, you're talking about the Pac-Man restaurant in the suburbs. That's really close here. But Chicago has a really awesome arcade pedigree. We just really are passionate about it. And, I would say that the barcades here stack up to any you know, all over the country. I mean, we love our arcade games, and the great games came out of Chicago. You know, not just Pac-Man, even Miss Pac-Man, but also Mortal Kombat. I mean, all these games that you would totally, you know, NBA Jam. I mean, in the 90s is like a whole nother era of these totally amazing games, you know, and it comes from Chicago.
Do you feel like Pac-Man helped with, you know, there's certain points in sort of video game history where you feel like it gets beyond just quote unquote the gamers, but becomes like a more mainstream thing? Do you feel like Pac-Man was like that? Because I remember playing Pac-Man, not in the arcades that much, but like in my grocery store or in the laundromat, you would find Pac-Man machines. So do you feel like that was another way to show people that like this is something that can be for everyone and not just for a select group?
Yeah, you know, in some ways I feel like it was a real turning point because it wasn't just going, you know, in the late 70s and early 80s, arcades were these sketchy places that you didn't really want to send your kids. But, you know, once Pac-Man got really big, people were like, oh, you know what, you can have one at the 7-Eleven on the corner. Yeah. You can, you know, have one in the grocery store. And it became, you know, much more socially acceptable, as funny as that sounds today. You know, no one's saying, oh, video games are gonna turn my kids into zombies and rot their brains. Like, you know, it really helped popularize video games, which is significant. You know, and I don't think people realize. I mean, you know, video games are just part of the fabric of culture now. But then it was very much like, what's this weird thing? Is it going to turn my kid into a mutant? You know.
I mean, we were talking a little bit just about, you know, the Pac-Man restaurant and all the barcades and stuff. Mm-hmm. Is there something that you would love to see Pac-Man related that you haven't seen yet, like a theme park or something?
Well, you know, that's interesting because in the 80s, the company that licensed Pac-Man, Midway, also, they bought a whole bunch of other companies and they diversified. And for a while, they owned Six Flags, the theme parks. And so in a couple of the Six Flags, there was a Pac-Man land with these super scary Pac-Man costumes. You know, I'm sure the people inside of there were walking around sweating. You know, I mean, it actually looked horrifying. But, you know, there were small, like, Pac-Man themed sections of the theme park for a while they owned it. You know, and I'm sure there were Pac-Man arcade games. They were really just trying to, like, you know, vertically integrate here. So, I mean, it would be interesting to see somebody do that well, but there was a Bud Light commercial a couple years ago where this guy ran through a live-size Pac-Man. I would love to have one of those. Maybe we could do that next year at C2E2. Could they just like have one out there and everybody could just run through the maze? I mean, if somebody's listening, we can make that happen. That would be really cool.
That'd be awesome.
Well, I remember when they changed the Google logo that one time, and it was, you could actually play Pac-Man, but in the Google logo, and there was like some report that came out that was like the lowest productivity day at work that day, and you could still like access it, and so it was really cool. And then I think Google Maps one time, they turned it into a Pac-Man maze, so.
Well, and the guys who created that's like a proud moment. You're like, look at how I influenced. Look at it. I got everybody to not do their work. So in the research that I'm doing for this Pac-Man history book that I'm writing right now, I actually interviewed one of the developers of that original Google Doodle who did that. And they went really, really hardcore. They're real gamers and they love it, and they wanted to make it just like it would be playing the original arcade game, down to, you know, Pac-Man can kind of take a corner faster than the ghost, and that's one of the ways you can sort of outsmart the ghost. So they did that in that original Google Doodle. So they took great pains to make that feel, you know, like an authentic Pac-Man experience, which is really cool. And the guy who was one of the main developers on that, he grew up in Poland actually, and his dad repaired arcade games. You know, so he's a friend of mine, and it's really cool just to see how that love for arcade games and games just kind of keeps going. And I think you can see that, you know, whether it's the original Pac-Man arcade game or something like that, there's a real love for that game.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny because I love Pac-Man as a video game, but I gotta be honest, I was all about the Pac-Man merch. Like I had Pac-Man puzzle, Pac-Man, there was a Pac-Man board game, which is just kind of funny, but I watched that Pac-Man cartoon like every Saturday morning, you know, and there's the Pac-Man Fever, the song. What do you think is like the craziest thing you've ever seen a Pac-Man version of? Like, just what is like weird Pac-Man merchandise that you've ever noticed?
Well, I had the Pac-Man sleeping bag, which was like, I loved that as a kid. I thought it was so awesome. I also had the Pac-Man bed sheets, which I think were really cool as well. But the craziest thing that I haven't seen, but I heard about in talking to the folks who were doing the licensing, they prototyped a Pac-Man toilet seat. Like,
what?
so imagine that. You know, it
Oh,
opens up,
no.
and what does Pac-Man do? You know, I'll leave it to your imagination. I'm really sad that didn't get through like the prototype stage, because that sounds amazing, right?
gosh.
Your kid is trying to learn how to, you know, how to poop. I mean, is there anything more horrifying than, yep, here's Pac-Man?
So would that be a new ghost named Stinky or Inky Blinky Stinky? And that's like, it's bad because I'm like, ew, but then I'm like, no, but I think about it, I can see it working.
I mean, that's
You
good
wouldn't want a
licensing.
Pac-Man toilet?
Can we Kickstarter that? I mean,
mean,
come on.
Start a Pac-Man toilet. So I personally wanted to bring back the Pac-Man cereal. I love that, which was just, it was just like little power pellets with the marshmallows.
Marshmallows.
In it. So yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm still thinking about that pack toilet.
I know, right? You know what I mean? Okay, we're gonna start a Kickstarter, you guys.
Yes,
Let's
yes.
do this.
All right, who wants to campaign for the pack toilet? All right, we already got a few backers
We got
right
some
now.
hands
There
up.
we go.
All right, next C2E2, we'll have them here on the show floor.
When did your love for Pac-Man first start?
You know, I think because you know, Pac-Man's always been around since I've been alive. Like, I feel like it's just in the fabric of the culture. You know, whether it was as a kid, I played those games. You know, I had the board game, I had the pajamas, whatever. You know, I think it's just the fact that Pac-Man sort of like pop culturally is just ever present in my life. And you know, it's not even me. It's just like you can't get away from it. It's like, okay, there's new Pac-Man games. They have the life-size Pac-Man. There's a Pac-Man restaurant, you know, half an hour from where I live. I mean, it's just, Pac-Man's just always there. And I think, you know, and that's one of the things that I've been trying to figure out as I've been writing this book is, why is Pac-Man still so popular? Like, what else from that era is still popular? You know, we're not talking about asteroids toilet seats,
No way.
although that's actually pretty interesting. You know, we're talking about Pac-Man, and I think there's something so fundamental and simple about the act of this guy running around a maze, eating. You know, it's this really simple, iconic design that you can recognize from anywhere. I mean, anytime you take a slice of pizza, you know, the first slice out of the pizza, it's like, oh, there's Pac-Man. You know, and I think I'm just fascinated with the longevity of a character like that.
Yeah, and you had mentioned that it was a character that had a face. You know, finally, it wasn't just a little square. But what else do you think people really, you know, resonate with Pac-Man?
I mean, we're not having this conversation, you know, almost 40 years later, if it wasn't a good game, right? You know, it was totally different game. It was really, like, it was very accessible. You could just walk right up to it and play it. You know, it's something that, but it was also like, has that addictive quality to it. Like, it's really fun. You just want to keep coming, putting quarters in there. But I think also it's just so fundamentally simple, you know, and fundamentally, like, there's something about, okay, you know what? I'm not trying to destroy anyone. I'm not trying to avoid, you know, some gruesome death. I'm eating, and I'm avoiding those ghosts, and it's not this crazy, stressful game. It's kind of fun, and, you know, there's a little bit of whimsy to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How far have you ever gotten in the game?
Oh, you know, secret, spoiler alert, I'm a terrible Pac-Man player. You know, so it's clearly not because it's an easy game. I mean, and I know people, you know, who are like world-class Pac-Man players, but I'm not a great Pac-Man player, but I like it.
I'm not either. Andre's really good at Pac-Man.
I'm pretty decent. But I was gonna say, like, I was thinking about it. Like, Pac-Man is also one of the first times I saw cutscenes because they had the different acts and stuff like that. So yeah, it's brought a lot to it. And then even today we're getting, like, we had Pac-Man in the Wreck-It Ralph and Pixels and like I said, Smash Brothers. We were literally together when Pac-Man got announced. And I lost my mind because I've been wanting Pac-Man in there for so long. I was like, yes.
And then we played it when he came out, and he destroyed me.
Yeah, but it was so fun, and I was like, oh, that fire hydrant, that's from Pac-Land, and whatever. So yeah.
Well, and I think it's so fun. Is like Pac-Man has this very vague semblance of a personality, but he's like the guy, you know, at the party that everybody can get along with.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, he's not like, oh, you know, you're like Ryu, you know, who's kind of, you know, you're a little sketchy sometimes, or you're kind of a jerk. You know, it's like, no, Pac-Man's just a nice guy, generally speaking. You know, and I think there's something about, he plays well with others, and I think that's why he's in stuff like Smash Brothers. It makes sense.
Yeah. Now, switching from Pac-Man to the Ghost, what I found was interesting is that for a long time when I was playing Pac-Man when younger, I was like, oh, the ghosts, like, I don't know what they're gonna do. And then you find out later that there was actually a little bit of actual patterns in them, like it wasn't as random as it seemed.
Right.
So,
yeah, it's totally not random. You know, the idea that each ghost has their own behavior. You know, and I think that's part of the secret to the game. But also there's some, you know, when you're working with such like narrow constraints in terms of like technical video games, the fact that they're creating this like really interesting AI where there are these patterns, is it gives these ghosts a little bit more of a personality, because they're not talking, they're not, you know, they're not acting, they're just there. But the way they react to Pac-Man makes it feel like, this game's kind of alive. Which is really interesting, and it's totally different than the approach they took about Miss Pac-Man. Now, here's a little aside. So, Pac-Man was created in Japan, but Miss Pac-Man was actually created by a bunch of MIT college students. So these guys at MIT, they had an arcade, and basically what they realized is that when people got really good at these games, they'd sit on one quarter for like an hour, so they weren't making any money. So, being MIT students, what do? Well, we got to come up with a solution for that. So they created these boards that they would basically put into the game that would make the games harder. And they sold these in the back of magazines, and they did this first with Missile Command. And basically, the company that made Missile Command was Atari. They sued them. These guys basically settled the lawsuit and were able to keep making these. So they made one for Pac-Man, and they said, we're going to sell this thing. We're going to make a bunch of money. People, arcade owners can put this in their game and make it harder so that they can make more money. It makes the game more challenging. Well, instead, they went to Midway, the company who basically licensed Pac-Man here, and they said, well, this is really cool. Instead of doing an unlicensed speed-up kit, which is what they called it, they said, why don't we turn this into an actual game? And that speed-up kit became Miss Pac-Man.
Wow.
So all the folks in Japan didn't really have anything to do with it except for, sort of approving the looks of the graphics. But, a bunch of college students basically created Miss Pac-Man. And it's this totally weird story. Pac-Man is Japanese, but by way of Boston and Chicago, he has Miss Pac-Man.
Wow, that's a really awesome story.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff. There were lawsuits on both sides, and hurt feelings, and there's other, all kinds of drama surrounding Miss Pac-Man. But Miss Pac-Man basically is like, even more popular than Pac-Man, especially in the day. It sold as many units as Pac-Man, and they thought, oh, well, this is just a way to extend the franchise, and we'll make a little bit more money. But it was another blockbuster hit for Midway, which is kind of crazy.
Wow.
What do you think is the craziest of all the? Because there's a lot of different Pac-Man spin-offs. Do you think there's one that stands out to you that's like, wow, that was an interesting turn for the Pac?
I think it's Pac-Land, the one that basically it's like a platformer, where he basically is a three-dimensional character. It just doesn't work for me.
Oh, really? I like Pac-Land.
I mean, I like the 3D. I think the farther you stray away from the original concept, I think the less it feels like Pac-Man. So that's why I like things like the 4-player Pac-Man, which Championship Pac-Man is like, that's a fierce game, right? And the life, they have a life-size Pac-Man. There's a huge Pac-Man screen. I think those are really interesting. But I feel like the farther you stray away from that original thing, it just feels different.
Yeah. Well, I think Pac-Man, I guess I like because it felt like the cartoon, which is what's
totally.
Yeah. See, mine is Professor Pac-Man, the educational
Oh, that's
one.
old school. Well, most people don't know about that game, and it's a fun game. And that reminds me of another really crazy one, which is Baby Pac-Man, which is a combination pinball and video game. So it was a pinball machine, and then it had a video game component. And they were like, oh, it's going to be this cool, groundbreaking thing. It combines the best of pinball and video games, and nobody liked it. Because pinball people didn't like it, video game people didn't like it, because it was just enough to not work that well. But it's really interesting. It's a beautiful looking cabinet. If you ever seen it, but it's one of those things where we're just not going to talk about that very much.
All right, so if Pac-Man had to eat his way through Chicago, what sort of landmarks do you think would be difficult for him?
Well, the Chicago River probably, because it's not the cleanest river. I think he might actually have to wrap up with that, because I think it might give you a little indigestion. We know we dye the river green every year, for St. Patrick's Day. I don't think that would probably go that well. I mean, I don't even know if there are still fish in the river. I think there's some, but I think that speaks to they're trying to clean it up.
So don't eat Chicago.
But it's been worse. But I wouldn't swim it a whole lot in it.
Oh my goodness.
That's funny.
Is there anything that you think that would be cool, video game wise, to do with Pac-Man today? Would you like to see a
MMO.
Tetris 99 Battle Royale type Pac-Man game? Or what do you think Pac-Man can still do today?
Well, I think VR and virtual reality and augmented reality are really interesting. I mean, the idea of AR is that you map sort of graphics on real life. I mean, wouldn't it be cool if we could just get up here and walk around and we're in a Pac-Man maze and there's dots at different booths? I mean, I think that would be really cool, and I think Pac-Man is simple enough that I think you could totally see it in VR. You know, it's not a super complicated environment to render, you know, and I think you could get in there and actually, it has a three-dimensionality to it, even though the first game is super flat. You know, you're just looking down on it. I think there's a suggested 3D there that would work really well in VR. So, I mean, I would absolutely, you know, all the Oculus guys, you know, if you're listening, let's get on that one too. You know, right after the Pac-Man toilet. You know,
oh my gosh,
I mean,
no.
You know, we're available as consultants, by the way. I mean, we come relatively cheap. Right?
I think it'd be cool if there was a game almost similar to like Mario Maker, where Pac-Man had to go from A to point B, and you gotta kind of make the stage.
You make your own mazes?
Yeah,
Yeah,
make your own
totally.
maze.
Fun one, yeah.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah.
I'd play that. Right on. Write that. Somebody write that down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I liked
Hey,
about that,
Nintendo.
what's Pac-Man 256, the like endless Pac-Man where like it's creeping up, which is so nice because that's a reference as well to the kill screen. But yeah, it's interesting how you can come up with these different ideas for such a simple concept.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's, you know, I'm a writer, but I'm also a graphic designer, and I think there's a design angle to Pac-Man. I think the game and the character are so simple that you can map a lot onto it. You can extend it in really interesting ways, in a way that, you know, maybe you couldn't do with Mario or, you know, Frogger or something like that. So I think Pac-Man is very flexible in that way, and yet you still feel like it's Pac-Man. You know, and I think that's probably some of the reason why we're still talking about Pac-Man, you know, almost 40 years later.
Do you feel like there's another character from that era that did not get the love? Like if Pac-Man took so much of the attention that someone else was in their shadow, like that you feel like still needs some recognition?
I think Dig Dug. Dig Dug is like, I mean, that's like a killer game. You know, you dig into the garden and you're saving the vegetables and you're throwing them at all these characters, you know, and he's in a little like space suit. I mean, like there's a cool character, you know, an interesting concept. Like you're digging in the garden, you know, and Dig Dug. It's just, I mean, you can't say that and not smile. Dig Dug, you know, it's fun, you know. So I mean, maybe, you know, Dig Dug and Pac-Man can like team up. You know, they could have like a Marvel team up book. You know, Pac-Man and Dig Dug fight Dr. Doom.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, they're always in like the Namco collections together.
Right. Right.
See, mine is Qbert. I think.
Oh, right on.
I think Qbert needs more recognition. He got his movie roles recently, but I want to see a little bit more of Qbert.
Yeah, no, Qbert's awesome. Maybe it's a translation thing. Nobody knows what he's talking about, you know? Like,
We know what he's saying. Yeah. So, what is there any kind of insight that you can tell us about this book that you're working on?
Yeah, so, you know, like we were already talking about some of the stories, but I really feel like, you know, Pac-Man is you know, in some ways, Pac-Man is a international character, you know, created in Japan, you know, popularized in Chicago, sequelized in Boston. I mean, you know, everybody has a story about Pac-Man, you know, and I think for me it was like, I want to explore why that is, you know, why are we still talking about such a super simple game, you know, and why people are fascinated. I mean, I've met all kinds of Pac-Man collectors. You know, there's people who are like really serious about, and there's crazy Pac-Man stuff. And so for me, it's the question is like not just like the secret history, because I think there's some really interesting stories about the history of Pac-Man, like, you know, what we've been talking about. But some of it is just exploring why is Pac-Man so interesting, and why do you see Pac-Man everywhere? I mean, if you jump on Twitter and you say, you know, you do a search for Pac-Man, people will show you like pictures of lily pads or, you know, fire hydrants that look like Pac-Man. I mean, people see Pac-Man everywhere, you know, and I don't have a working title for the book yet, but one of the thoughts I had is it called Pac-Man Everywhere? Because we just see Pac-Man, and I think that really says something. There's a universality of the design of Pac-Man, and like I'm really interested in exploring that and what that means to people.
Yeah, and you mentioned you also do graphic design, so are you going to contribute some of those skills to the book as well?
I'd like to. I mean, every book that I've worked on, I've had a hand in the design, you know, in some level, whether it's art directing or, you know, something like that. So, I mean, there's a lot of cool like art out there that people are sort of remixing Pac-Man, or, you know, some really weird versions of Pac-Man. And I would love, you know, we'll see what happens, but I would love to showcase some of that, and make sure that people see that, yeah, Pac-Man can get remixed and changed and still come out feeling like Pac-Man.
Yeah, and so next year is the 40th anniversary, right?
That's right.
So is there anything big happening for that?
I don't know. I think there will be. I think Bandai Namco will probably announce more going on. I don't know if the book will be done for the 40th anniversary, but I mean, it's something exciting, and it's pretty cool. And it is a sort of it's a cultural, you know, icon, but it's also a big part of video game history.
Yeah.
You know, which is really cool.
I think I just think it's gonna be interesting. I think that you're gonna still see Pac-Man in some form or variation, or just even the original game. I feel like every time I get a new console, there's some. I end up buying Pac-Man again on it or something.
Yeah, and what other character can you say that about? It's like, you know, has a game on every single console. I mean, whether it's mobile or, you know, the Sega Saturn or, you know, I mean, like Pac-Man is just everywhere. You know, and there's always, you know, people are like, oh, there's another Pac-Man.
Yeah.
But there's something about it. It's like I talked at my daughter's, you know, first grade class, and I said, I write books about video games. And I said, how many of you guys, 6-year-olds, how many of you know Pac-Man? They all raised their hands, 6-year-olds. You know, like the fact that they know who Pac-Man is, I think really speaks to like the ongoing cultural relevance of Pac-Man. And not to sound all highfalutin about it, but I think there's something there. It's like, what is a more recognizable character than Pac-Man?
I even had that infamous Pac-Man, the Atari one.
I think it's very popular to say that's the worst game ever.
No, I disagree. Yeah.
No, it's a good game.
It's just so different, but I enjoyed it.
And I wrote an article for a magazine earlier this year interviewing the developer of that game, and he designed it. And he basically said, you know, if we would have known that people wanted their home video game to be just like the arcade game, we would have made it that way.
Oh,
we would have tried it. You know, I mean, you guys think about it. This is the Wild West, right? The idea of taking a arcade game and turning it into a console game, that was a new thing. So like if they would have, you know, if they would have thought all we had to do is change the colors so that it looked black and blue, just like the arcade, they totally would have done it. You know, and you're going from a really complicated, complex piece of hardware to a really simple, you know, a much simpler setup on the home arcade. You know, there's some changes, there's some challenges you have to deal with. But I think it's a really solid game. You know, so, and it's really interesting to hear that story. So, you know, there's myth and then there's fact. And I think I'm excited about trying to separate those two a little bit.
Well, especially on the internet, we always appreciate that.
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, this is so great. I feel like we just did like the Pac-Man, this is your life moment right here, but it's really fun. So yeah, so we'll be sure to keep an eye out for that book. Cool. And the Kickstarter for Pac Toilet will be available later on this afternoon. And bring back Pac-Man cereal. Thank you so much for being here and telling us about this. All right, we're going to keep this thing going here at SYFY, here at C2E2. If you want to continue the conversation with us, you can do that online or right here in person. Hashtag C2E2, hashtag It's a Fan Thing. Coming up next, we got Colin Donnell coming up on the stage, so be sure to check out that. Thank you once again, Tim. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
And we'll keep things going here. SYFY Live from C2E2. Thank you.